Good afternoon, good evening. Nice to see all of you. I think we gathered here in a format which is more or less analogous to what we typically do when there's an exhibition at SCI-Arc. So there's an exhibition, and then there's a critique, a discussion, an analysis. So congeniality wouldn't necessarily be the watchword. What we're trying to do is understand what was done and why it was done and what could have been, might have been, should have been done. So that's the spirit in which these discussions take place. Andy mentioned to me that he wanted to, before we start, I wanted to go through a couple of drawings which nominally explain, as he understands it, as he explains it, the drawings explain why the exhibition takes the form that it takes. So he thought it was useful. I don't think anybody has any objection to that. So he's going to take a minute or two just to run through that. You want to do that?
Should I do that right now? Great, thank you. And it's funny, these things are usually also in situ, so there's a more informal air to them, and I really put together incredibly crummy slides just because we talked about this at lunch, and I threw these together, kind of iPhone pictures. But I'll just, so think of it as a conversation, and I think we very much thought of the exhibition as probably I thought we had more liberty and even responsibility compared to a lot of the other venues that will be dealing with the Getty Initiative to make it a bit of inside baseball, that is colleagues talking to colleagues as much as it is a discussion to the general public. I'll show these diagrams. I just want to say that the thinking behind the diagrams not only came from the analysis of the work, but it really came from going through and listening to the 9 lectures that were given in 1979, the 10 lectures counting Coy Howard's, given in 1979, which we have archived. And really a lot of the clues of how the show was going to be organized emerged from that. So I'm going backwards with this, and the argument in the diagrams is that there is, standing underneath architecture in general, architecture undertaken as a serious proposition, a spatial underpinning, a spatial and geometric logic that underpins that architecture, and it is sometimes not the obvious thing when one looks at work, but it stands under it, and one can trace certain lines of it, certain tangents, and certain departures from that. The show is very much organized like that. So working backwards from some of the more eccentric clues was Eric's talk from 1979. We're talking about the loss of the collective and fragmentation into the individual, and shows this very enigmatic project by Isosaki for the Gunma Museum. In particular, the theater in the back, which has this rotated cube projected onto the walls, which in that case becomes simply lines. And then other things where, while in the East Coast you could find lots and lots of obsessions with plan geometries and their rotations, leaving the tectonics intact, what we started seeing, sometimes in a quite recessive way, is fiddling with the tectonic logic itself, what I call a section rotation or crooked construction. So, for instance, Eric's pinball house may not look like that overtly, but these are screenshots from the 79 lecture, by the way. If you see the bowstring truss in there, to make it, it's in fact not done correctly. Very hard to see. Frank Gehry talking about his own house. He had the sketch for a window and kept discussing how it was describing a certain kind of rotation and projection. He couldn't figure out what it was, went through all of these various study models, none were right. Then he shows it as it was finished and he says, well, we didn't get it right, but this is as close as what we got. So what was this kind of space, these exceptional orientations and rotations that worked there? Again, you can see it recessively. I think you see it obviously later, and not only in Eric's work, but in Tom and Michael's work as well. But this is a relatively small detail, but in the Sedlak house by Morphosis, you see that. And then, of course, for instance, in the 708 house with the canted roof plane, I could give lots of examples. And then going backwards to other kinds of strange projections, you saw Coy Howard's drawls, if you've been through there, which I think are quite important and rarely see the light of day. But this is Frank Gehry's World Savings and Loan Bank in Burbank, where the facade itself is a kind of flattened projection. And so there's a series of diagrams. I'm not going to list them other than to say they start off with the kind of axonometric and a regression into the postmodernism of perspective would be the second diagram. And then increasingly plan rotation, flat projection, sectional rotation, flat wraps, and then finally what I'm calling an eccentric projection. So the work, there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between the sequence of work and those types, but it is roughly synchronized that way. And the various installation pieces, the 3 walls, 1 upstairs and 2 downstairs, as well as the sort of introductory wrap, are meant to be sort of spatial clues and references to that progress. So Todd showed them briefly in his lecture, and I just wanted to just talk about them for a second, and that's it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me go through a couple of questions. There are any number of vantage points that we could depart on, and I think fill up the next 45 minutes or so, and we can't do all of them. I think the explanation I was looking for from Andy, which I'm not sure he gave, had to do with whether the content of the exhibition, this scholastic intellectual content, what was being shown, correlated with the form of the exhibition. In other words, the configuration, the walls, the panels outside the gallery, what's on the second floor and so on. In other words, is there a relationship between the form and the content, or does one depart from the other? And we talked about that briefly, and his explanation, which I found a little bit arcane and academic, was that the drawings that he produced that are at the entrance to the gallery explain, in his view, how various architects develop space, and that the arrangement of walls and panels and partitions that he developed were coincident with the spatial theories that were offered in 1979, meaning 2013 is an equivalent or equivalency with 1979. And whether you can see that or feel that or understand that or believe that, I think is something that we need to touch on, because if the content of the exhibit, and we have to decide what that ought to be, and the form of the exhibit are different, and there may be a certain amount of confusion that has to do with the intention of the exhibition. Why are we doing this? What are we showing? Who are we telling what? And I guess in the end, you walk out knowing something you didn't know when you arrived. I wanted to start out with something which is a little bit off that chart, and has to do with a general conception of all of these exhibits that the Getty very generously has supported. And it has to do with a conception of history which is an interest of mine, more along the lines of what exactly history means, and why, after all, should there be an exhibition that divides and discusses architecture generationally. Is architecture generational? Is a group that belongs to a particular time a group that should be talked about in terms of a particular period of time? Is that the way to talk about architecture at all? Or, for instance, are there correlations that jump generations and time and so on and so on? And maybe any of you guys or all of you guys can take a crack at that one. Why are we doing it like this anyway?
You want to take that one?
No.
You mean why are we doing why are we looking at a particular moment, or why a historical exhibition at all?
Well, I mean, for anybody who's involved in these discussions, there are very conventionally comments about your generation, my generation, and the presumption is that the differences between architects has at least something to do with the time they arrive and the time they depart. So the content of the work is related to those issues. And I'm just asking you if that's true or not. That's what you did. So the question is, why'd you do it that way?
Well, is it what we, I mean, is that in the exhibition? I mean, do you read that from the exhibition? I mean, it certainly was in the conversations and some of the writing, but I'm not sure that that's...
Well, it's a group of people who are roughly contemporaneous, taken out of a particular point in time, and the presumption is that that group of roughly a certain age at roughly a certain amount at a certain point in time defines content of work. I mean, you hear those discussions all the time.
Well, but I think, this is a group, or let's say this is a period in which several groups got assembled by different people and under different circumstances. Many of those groups are denied today or downplayed today. And so one of the things, at least for me in looking at this material, was that on one hand, there seems to be a kind of general understanding in the kind of, let's call it the contemporary architectural community of what was going on then. But as I pointed out in the lecture last week, and as I've written, the history of Los Angeles architecture, at least as a kind of, the big books all stop around 1970. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that hasn't been written yet. And so we saw that this particular group, for a lot of reasons, as a worthwhile lens to start to examine how those various groups came together. So the fact that all the lectures that were given in concert with the exhibitions in 1979 were recorded and we still have them was a big deal. The fact that John Dreyfus reviewed each one of those exhibitions in the LA Times was a big deal. And the fact that we were able to find a lot of the work that was in the shows was also a big deal. So that there was a kind of curious density of archival material from which we could start with. Now, building out from that, there was also, if you limited it to just those exhibitions, what you found was they didn't paint a very complete picture of any of the practices that were involved. And so these diagrams were the sort of end result of a very long process between the three of us of trying to kind of make sense of, getting through that historical material, figuring out how to present it today, and sticking to the story of those original 1979 exhibitions, but being able to tell it in a way that it was useful today. I'm not sure that that's super clear, but...
Could I add something?
I mean, sure, it's clear, but essentially what you're doing is you're saying what the architecture community in general looks at it in a certain way, or that group was assembled in a certain way. I think my point would be 30 years past, what do we know now that we didn't know then?
Well,
what mistakes did they make? Is that group a plausible group, or should it have been done in an entirely different way? That's all. In other words, the fact that a lot of people see it that way only means a lot of people see it that way. It doesn't mean that's the way it is.
But actually, just to back up to the generation question, though, because I think that, I don't think that was the intention. In fact, one of the appealing things about the list of people that Tom put together originally was that there was a certain kind of practical or sort of arbitrary pulling together of people that seemed to be doing interesting things at the time. And in fact, there was like a 20-year age range within that group. People come at the end of, some people at the end of their careers, in fact, others just getting started. And I think that was precisely not an attempt to not categorize things generationally, and that's, that.
But I just want to add something. It's interesting. When the project came, and I must say, it was a long process to get it, and these guys were at it for a long time, and then suddenly it was all worked out and I got to jump in, so I didn't do that much work to get it, like the story about the little red hen. But I'm looking at it, I'm thinking like, oh boy, here's a moment in time and a bunch of architects, some of who didn't really pan out, and a bunch of other ones went on to do terrific work, weren't necessarily, doing it then. What are we going to do with this? Right? That was, in my ignorance, the whole thing took place 5 or 6 years before I ever got here. Then the process that Todd's talking about, going through it, watching the lectures, etc., certain things started to dawn on me at least. And it was reminding me of this, we had this talk here the other day for the thesis students. Hernan was here, Jeff Kipnis. There was a discussion about why these thesis students showing their precedents, like they feel like they've got to show the Ville Savoie and something else. And my argument was, it's bad to do that as some sort of knee-jerk reflection on history. You should think of it instead as works by colleagues that you're in conversation with. I said, if you're an architect working on a project, there's historians look at old projects in a certain way, and architects look at it in terms of, in what way does this have a conversation? And so the idea of, when you were saying, like, was any of this going on in any of your minds at the time in terms of the diagram, I sensed there was a kind of intuition and in varying degrees an articulation of it, but I think it's something that you could see in retrospect. In other words, look at where not only a lot of your practices went, but where the world of architecture, well, you could start to sniff out some of these things. It seemed like the geometry was a good tool to do that, and is not the one that maybe comes in more conventionally when we're looking, certainly like, Frank's work of that period gets looked at a lot, and a lot is talked about with the construction, et cetera. But it seemed like a way to say, basically saying, okay, why is this interesting to us today? Whether we made it so or answered that question or not is open for discussion. But I think that was the intention of it. There's other things, which is the historical moment, which was also important. I think it makes for not necessarily an interesting exhibition. I think it was very much concentrated on extracting those actual things, those drawings, those models, those photographs, that people could get a sense of what the work was, not so much the sense of other things, which are perhaps equally important, but would be a different scope.
There was, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, and I give you an example of what I'm really thinking of, and maybe the expectation is unfounded. But when Jacob Burckhardt in the 19th century wrote that book, The Civilization of the Renaissance,
right,
it was 400 years after the Renaissance. So all the characters who were
right,
involved in the Renaissance went through all of their lives and had no idea that they were part of the Renaissance. Didn't know that. It took a few hundred years to figure out that they were, if indeed they were. So that's so the act of labeling that era or that generation gave it a very different meaning. Mm-hmm. And I think ideally at some point somebody might come along and take this thing apart and right, look at it again and define it, and I think as an aspiration, that's the way one might look at what all this means. What did it say about the city? What did it say about the architects? What did it say about the time? Those are. I mean, right, some of those things have been mentioned. What did it say about the media? Mm-hmm. What did it say about various cities in America and how they're situated in terms of a sense of potency of architecture, of coverage of architecture? Because one of the things you guys have talked about, at least in that line of thinking, is what John did, what he wrote, and I think that obviously was critical, and that may or may not be related to academic issues. You talk a little bit about Harvard. You never talked about Charlie Moore at all, who was in LA, went to Yale, so that there was no mention of him. But the Japanese media, which is not mentioned, Toshio Nakamura, Futagawa, who just died very recently, and I know personally, from my point of view, we couldn't get anybody in the United States to run anything we were doing. Right. And Nakamura would turn around and Futagawa, and it was very useful from my point of view, selfish point of view, to have that kind of support from international media in that situation in Tokyo. Mm-hmm. And then there are people like Herbert who came along, left New York saying nothing's going on and came to LA. That may be slightly later. And it seems to me that if you're trying to characterize that era, that at least a piece of the discussion has to do with a very significant role of media, not as an incident, but it changed the whole tone. I mean, you can agree with it or disagree with it, but you can see the role of the media, particularly in a context when there's no internet and there are 3 right. television stations or something. And so when Dreyfus writes an article, it's totally different for many the reason than when Chris Hawthorne writes an article.
Right.
I mean, everybody read Dreyfus. I'm not sure who reads Hawthorne, which is not necessarily Dreyfus's fault or Hawthorne's fault. But what is the media in its form, not only what it did and who did what, mm-hmm. and where the support came, but the power of it and what that did to the context of a discussion or argument, which is an interesting question.
It's an absolutely interesting question. I think you've just outlined a 500-page book potentially on this period, and I mean, one of the things that I think is important. The show was a kind of snapshot. I mean, that this is a period that not a lot of work has been done. Burckhardt got to wait 400 years. We didn't get to wait 40.
No one's dead.
Yeah, what they used to tell us when I was doing my PhD was, don't work on anyone that's alive. Everybody's alive.
He invented it. I think that was my point, right. Notwithstanding the time. He invented a different way to see it.
I would say this. I think that there are different kinds of historical projects. I think Dreyfus's journalistic efforts at the time, on the fly, trying to kind of grab something that was still very much in process is one version of it. Burckhardt or Tom Hines or someone writing a very much a kind of after the fact account of what happened back then is another. And I think we're operating somewhere in between. I don't think our ambitions, I wouldn't want anyone to look at them as trying to make a definitive statement about this generation as a kind of larger. We could have, but I don't think we could have done that in that space. I don't think that would have made a particularly interesting exhibition. And one of the things that we were trying to keep our eyes on was that space, was that it had a kind of historical agenda, which we laid out in a series of essays in the catalog. One of them I presented last week, but there are others. So looking at different slices through that era to try to kind of assemble the raw material, which is going to continue to be mulled over. So I would want this to be seen not so much as this is what happened, but here's one of many cracks at this time, in the hopes that 100 years from now, somebody can kind of pick up these pieces and give it a name.
Well, I think the role of the media is a perfect example. I mean, we had that discussion early on and decided that there would not be a lot of text in the exhibition. It would be, despite the kind of overlay of sort of didacticism, that it would not be very didactic in terms of what's actually displayed. And I think that was a decision early on. I mean, so then how do you talk about something like the LA Times in an exhibition like that with that kind of mandate?
Well, that's the issue for the person who makes the exhibit.
Right. Or how do you show grainy old videos that are an hour and a half long and frankly sort of boring? It's a real problem, but it was one that we
that's why they called you, man.
Yeah. And that's why our exhibition designer said no movies.
We have snippets.
There was another issue that came up the other night that had to do with the politics in the broadest sense, from Harvard Yard, William Sloane Coffin, Berkeley, Vietnam, civil rights. Somebody stood up and was yakking about that. And I know SCI-Arc in its infancy liked to claim that in a sense it belonged to an era that turned things, teach your children well and all of that stuff. I don't actually believe that, but I think that's certainly part of the conventional story. I mean, I think SCI-Arc changed when this thing was done.
I agree.
Not because SCI-Arc was contingent on Berkeley or Harvard Yard or something. I mean, I think this is the doing of the exhibition was a very substantial transformation in priorities in America, in Los Angeles versus New York, in media, in terms of the content of architecture and the potentialities for architecture. I think that point could have been made in a more substantial way, and one of the ways to have made it would have been to illustrate what the points were. In other words, what was it before? What preceded it? What was the argument at SCI-Arc or wherever it was with Pulliam, Zimmerman, those guys who to some extent controlled the discourse, if there was a discourse in Los Angeles? What changed specifically, or what attitudes changed, and what was being advocated? And I think that's significantly different, and it may be that to this day that the seeds of where SCI-Arc is belong to some of those discussions, at least on the part of some of the architects.
Well, I'd like to think a fair amount of that information was in the presentation I did last week, and that it does exist in the catalog essay. But you're right. I mean, I think to bring home the point of that transformation in SCI-Arc is important, because that generational shift was significant, and I do think that these exhibitions were a kind of fulcrum.
But what was the shift?
I think this was if we look at the kind of long history of SCI-Arc in terms of its directors, for instance, I think this was the first move to think about an alternative to the Cappy era of the school. That the school had been founded in a certain way with a certain group of characters. There was a certain hierarchy that was embedded in that group of characters, and I think that this was a moment where you and him and several other people began to move fairly aggressively to upset that hierarchy. And I think 10 years later, that work had been, well underway. I
don't know. I mean, this is where the sort of discussion about who did what in the exhibit and my role in this thing probably are at cross purposes. I have a feeling that the exhibition was done. It's funny, I was talking to Hawthorne about this. I think he's going to write something probably not particularly congenial. And his sense of all of these things is somehow to do with how calculated or how cynical, which is a very odd word, that a lot of these things were. And that somehow this was directed, this whatever the impetus for this was directed at a particular character, the director of the school, or a group of people who were in the city and seeming to control the discourse at the time. I just had a feeling it was much more innocent than that.
You're talking really about the 79 series.
It had to do with that it wasn't so calculated that Dreyfus was coming. You go to the movies with Dreyfus and his wife. That it wasn't so much what can we get the Times to do, or how can we add a lecture to an exhibit, to an article, and overwhelm everyone that we're here and
I don't think that
I don't think it was done that way.
No, I don't know, and these are the scholars, but I'm going to, as far as I can see, if we didn't have that 79 show as a basis, but just that period, it's not clear who else we would have pulled into this in LA. In other words, I think did a pretty good job of gathering up who was interesting to gather up, and maybe even a few, maybe even a generous group. So, you know, that would be my counter to
I'm just talking about the
thought that
spirit in which it was done. I'm just saying it wasn't a tactical,
Right.
strategic.
I think that's clear from, if you actually
Not
sit
at
down
all.
and watch
I
the
mean,
lectures, that's
I think it just had to do
absolutely clear.
with some people and their interests and their predilections, which didn't coincide conceivably with others.
I
So
think
let's
that-
do what we do, and the hell with the other people. It wasn't so much an adversarial thing as it was you kind of striking out on your own.
I think that that's very much. I wouldn't try to make the case that it was calculated, but I would say this, that the Burckhardt of 300 years from now, looking back, is going to look at the evidence and the aftermath and say, boy, this looks calculated. And
Well, maybe that's a problem with writing history.
that it may be, but I think.
Or maybe that's why history is continually rewritten.
Well, let me ask you this: is it possible for something to be undertaken innocently and have effects
Yeah, sure.
far beyond their intention to innocently pursue individual interests? Because I think it did have a really dramatic effect on the culture of not just the school, but also of the city, whether or not you intended it,
Okay.
whether or not any of the participants intended it.
Okay. I mean, I think but it's not clear what your view is of that. In other words, if New York in a proprietary way, I mean, you had right after that people like Pete Cook, Pricks, even Charlie Jenks, who used to stop in Cambridge. And I don't know whether they kicked him out or he changed his mind, but whatever they were doing, they were flying over New York and they were landing in Los Angeles. So there was a sense in a proprietary way that there was a discussion going on here that for certain people was more useful than the discussion which seemed to have more the media in its hands.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So that was, I think that was a significant change, no question about it. I just don't think you get it for people who weren't here at the time and don't quite know what they're looking at in there.
Well, I would count myself among that group.
Right. So the question is, what should they understand about that period of time that was essential to that period of time? What made it what it was? And do we come to know that looking at the work in the exhibition?
See, I think the things that you're touching on are not only important, they're big. I think the strength of the exhibit is that it's a small exhibit. In other words, it doesn't it is in the spirit of, let's say, studio visits by colleagues, looking at work and having a discourse about the work itself, and understanding in terms of putting it together to show what was important about it, the actual spelling out its influence and the historical moment and the sort of give and take and revolution of it is simply not in it. I mean, I don't see that as maybe it's seen as a deficit, but it was quite intentionally not that broad. In other words, it is in the spirit of a kind of, work taken carefully from the studio to be looked at as work in and of itself.
But
which I think is a different, it overlaps with a broader discussion, but that's what I meant, when I was talking about the kind of, let's say, the inside baseball part of it. The other part, I think, is important.
What do you mean inside baseball? You mean the players who are playing the game, or the people who are sitting in the bleachers, or the people who are...
people who are interested in some of the certain minutiae about the work that may seem not so important to the general public, but amongst architects it becomes incredibly important. Like the stuff that I found in the works that are in there are almost without exception things that have become important to me as an architect. And I don't, so I can't help but put it together. One has a particular set of eyes through which one does it. I don't, whether it's defining if Burckhardt didn't define the Renaissance, someone else was defining something. I don't think there's a objective truth to be told, and I think we never.
Well, maybe it's not so much there is, but maybe the game is you have to believe that there is at the time you're telling it, which is different.
I think the diagrams are objective truth.
But does the story have to be about that period? I mean, is it not possible to collect a body of work and read it not with the intention of properly contextualize it in its era of creation, but rather finding what's interesting in it today? And I think that is one of the things that we were trying to do with the show is, can we kind of do that historical work, primarily in the book part of our project, but really find new ways to see this stuff, find new lenses through which to examine it, try not to kind of reinscribe or elucidate these kind of old legends and rumors, but rather kind of see it in a different way.
Right. I think I'm not sure I know what the specific consequence of that is, but I think you would have to say there's an exhibit that is, this is what this group of people did at a certain time. You want to know what they did? Here it is. In other words, it's about the time it was done, not anything beyond that, but to the extent you could collect it and assemble it and however you did it, it's about that time. There's another exhibit which is from our contemporary vantage point, looking back on that exhibit and seeing strands that run back into the past and forward into the future. How would you trace the lineage, which would be an interesting discussion? In other words, what do you see there that tells you something about what you're seeing now? That's another way to look at it. I think there's another way to look at it, which is an entirely contemporary view, which is, what the hell is there in that gallery or any of the work that these characters did, which is useful to us today? If you want to talk about it going forward, I mean, you have a student audience here, at least in part. What do they find constructive, useful, in terms of the way they evaluate their own work and see themselves going forward? So I think one of the questions would be fundamentally, what is it that the show aspires to do? And what the drawings do, strangely enough, is this, nobody should get too offended, but I remember Johnson coming to LA and saying to me, Moss, deconstruction, whatever that is, deconstruction is about the diagonal line. Direct quote. It's about whatever you make of that. I get it. It's about the diagonal line, presumably as opposed to the right angle or something. And to distill a certain kind of sensibility, you might be able to talk about whatever they think deconstruction is and what its roots are. I don't think it's reducible to geometries. When I saw this thing, it was a slightly different question. You want to be a radical architect in 1979? Okay. Here are the moves you can make. If you make those moves, you'll be that kind of architect, a la, there's a kind of teaching tool. And to make the point, you go out into the foyer and somebody 30 years later is showing you, maybe, how to make those moves. You bend this, you fold that, you wrap it over the surface or whatever it is. It just seemed to me that what you were really doing was reducing a sensibility and a direction, and I'm not even sure it's a direction, it's an opposition to a previous way of seeing and thinking, which is not so easy to qualify or quantify. And you tried to quantify it or qualify it, and then teach us how to be a 1979 architect.
But I'm pretty
I do-
certain no
there
one in
are
this
six-
room, I'm pretty certain nobody in this room would mistake the 2013 stuff from the 1979 stuff. I think there's something slightly missing in that formula you just laid out.
But it's not my formula.
And we do break the diagonal into at least 6 different subcategories, so.
But I'm not sure that writing a cookbook was what we were trying to do.
No, and it's not, look, and I think, never mind the exhibit, like if we took students and probably even a lot of colleagues here today and started showing them the stuff, they're going to say, this is old-fashioned and of no relevance to me. And
You mean the work?
Yeah, I think they would say that. And I think what
Intrinsically has no value.
I'm not saying, no, I'm saying this is like, somebody's looking at this like, why are you showing me this old stuff? We don't want to see this. I think what,
That kind of means it has no value.
well, I'm not saying they're
say
right.
yes.
I'm just saying that would be, if you
Who would be saying that?
I'm Jonah. I'm just sorry. Sorry. No, I'm just,
It's
like,
Jonah, that's
you know kids today, they don't read their history, they don't, so the idea of the diagrams is to also provide a kind of X-ray, independent of the patina and the yellowing and all this, and saying, no, don't just think, oh, this is from before I was born, how could I be looking at this? It's a different thing. So the idea of it is to think of it as, and I think that's a legitimate,
Look, I mean,
Point.
this is a completely different problem, but speaking of bringing a contemporary point of view to this, that's so 10 minutes ago. Huh? So why are we bothering with that?
but that's what I'm saying, that
Which-
the idea of showing this work and with the diagrams was to put it into saying that there's a completely different,
No.
much longer series of
But it's
discussions
conceivable.
and techniques and conversations.
But it's conceivable that the value or the content of work is not strictly speaking to whether you have iPhone 5 or iPhone 4 or
Right.
Kobe 8s or Kobe 7s.
No, I mean,
Do you have
what
Kobe
I'm-
8s or Kobe 7s?
I don't even know what that is. That's all. No,
It's a basketball
what's-
shoe.
What I'm arguing is that what I'm arguing is that the attempt here was to take it out of that discussion and put it into a context of longer trajectories of techniques and developments and influences through the device of, let's say, certain way of looking at the spatial underpinnings of some of the projects.
I think what I'm making an effort to say is that there may be an intrinsic interest in all kinds of subjects, irrespective, which is why I asked the original question about why date all of these things. Sometimes in some places, there is value intrinsic to whatever it is. A piece of science, a piece of writing, a piece of art, a piece of architecture has a value which is not necessarily to be determined by its date. And the question, for me, the question would be, is the work of that time, or any of the work of that time, does it have those kinds of durable values? If it does, show us what they are. And my assumption is that a constituency like this is receptive and open and interested. I'm not so sure that the guy you're picking on over there, but I think if you gave him a shot at it, and
Right.
he gave him a premise that might not have crossed his mind, he might begin to understand in terms of its durability. So I don't think you have to huckster it in order to give it credence.
Oh, that's what, I mean, I think what you described, whether successful or not, I think that was explicitly our intention. In other words, to give a certain lens through which one can understand the work as, again, of its time, but also in a broader dialogue across time.
I mean, I think that
Across time sounds funny with you guys. Like, it's not like we're not talking about the ancient Greeks here, but
I mean, just to talk a little bit about the exhibition design, because I think that was an attempt, we did attempt to do that, and that we could argue whether it's successful or not, but for example, simply the decision we made to not have texts, wall texts associated with each individual object, and to instead treat it as a kind of a standalone document, or a wall text that was at the beginning was a kind of invitation, in a sense, to...
When you say wall text, you mean when you come to each item?
Yeah,
and
that we
you
didn't label each
identify it
section.
or-
So there wasn't a
explain the
label
background
on each
and-
vertical, those monolith, don't have a section 2, a flat wrap, section 3, right? That there was the guide was meant to act as a kind of model or sort of invitation to do the same, in a sense, right? As opposed to impose a kind of canonical set of categories on the work. I mean, that may seem like a kind of completely ahistorical or atheoretic kind of position, but I think that was a struggle, right? Because 30 years ago, the durability is demonstrated. I don't know how we would even determine that at this point. So, my view was that this document was the document. I mean, the kind of gallery guide was a sort of a possible interpretation. But by leaving the work without explicit information was a kind of invitation to take that model and sort of do what
you had the opportunity
do what
to
you
go
wanted
through
with it.
without the gallery
Right.
guide, for instance. Or
You
with
know,
a
I
different
I mean, that was the
guide.
intention.
I mentioned I was talking to Andy a little bit about, we hadn't talked about it, we talked about it an hour or so, a couple hours ago, and I mentioned to him, because he was explaining to me the relationship between the walls, which, by the way, and I said this, I don't mind saying it publicly, if you took down everything, if you took down all the models, left the model stands, the walls, and the folded stuff in the front, it's conceivable you would have a completely different discussion just with the pieces and spaces in relation to one another intrinsically. And the question is, does hanging all the other stuff around it either add to it but clearly there's a point of view that you get a sense of on the part of the guy who made it. And whether, as I said before, whether that's coincident with not what nominally is the content, or whether it supersedes the content or buries the content or is in some way separated from the content, I think is one of the issues when you make an exhibition that way. What I mentioned to him was, I remember, I'm not sure how many years ago, but maybe 8-10 years ago, and I was teaching at Yale, and there was, in the politics, this never quite worked out, and Levius came to Yale, and he wanted to make an exhibition which illustrated what Paul Rudolph had done before everybody filled everything in and changed it. And the way that he did it was to run a series, it's very artfully, as he would do it, and run a series of strings all over the place. So you could understand spatially, but it was subtle, but it wasn't that subtle. So you could understand what had been filled in and what had been removed and all of that. And what we were talking about is that the configuration of the pieces here and the relationship of one wall to another, or one side of one wall to another side of another wall across the space, however you did it, and whether Leb's way of doing it was the way to do it, that it's not intelligible, I didn't think, that the associations weren't particularly clear, and that there could be another way which was much more emphatic and definitive about the kinds of things you were making, the spaces you were making, into which you were putting pieces which in fact ratified that, at least right. the way you looked at it. And the funny thing about the Isesaki, I didn't realize that was, I guess I just missed it, and I was looking at the thing. And I have one more little story to tell. When Isa came and made his show, I think close to the time that MoCA opened, but maybe I have the dates wrong, and he couldn't come to the show. He's stuck somewhere. So he called up and he said, Moss, would you mind being a docent and just walk around and get an audience and walk around and tell people what I did, explain it. So can you do that? So I said, okay. And the Gunma Museum, and I remember it very well, has that rotated piece, which for you guys seems to have an association. And I mentioned to Andy, there's two Sterling buildings, one in Cologne and one in Dusseldorf, that did that kind of thing. The argument by the architect was, I rotated it in Dusseldorf because it faces an intersection with it, and so on. And the argument that so people were walking around, and I talked about this rotation. Everything is orthogonal. One piece is turn and plant. Some guy said, "What the hell is? It's not a big deal." Some guys, we've seen that before. And my sense, and the reason I think it got into the lecture was, but for him as somebody who is learning to do it yourself is an extremely critical piece of education in architecture. So it wouldn't be enough to say Sterling had done it or someone had done it, therefore. So the point was not that it was entirely novel or inventive in an absolute sense. So there are things that architects do that have to do with how architects get a hold of things and learn about how to manage, and you have to do it, actually, not flipping through some magazine saying, he did it, I better do the next thing. And I think it's an interesting lesson for a kind of redundancy, sort of intellectual redundancy, that you have to go through certain things. You don't get to go around them.
Right.
Although, and I think the contemporary discussion has a lot to do with going around, in my arcane view of the thing. It's just odd that it showed up, but the meaning of the drawing, at least as Andy translated it, was quite different. Anyway, you want to respond to that, and then?
I mean, I like that story for a lot of reasons. I mean, the Sterling invocation is one, because I think when you go through the show, you can see a lot of Sterling in there, interpreted in different ways by different people. And that process of having to go through it yourself, I think that is evident in there. And again, I mean, I don't think we wanted to kind of put arrows on that and say, here's architect A copying architect B, et cetera. But I think, we weren't oblivious to those kinds of connections, and hopefully they're there to be kind of teased out of that show.
Okay. I think that's all I got. So, any corrections? Comments? Too bad, mainly. Hi.
No mention of postmodernism, which was rampant in the mid to late 70s. I heard Deborah Sussman mention at Bernard's ceremony how Bernard at an AIA convention made a button that he wore very proudly saying, "I don't dig graves." And Bernard was a perfect kind of spokesman for Southern California and LA, specifically LA. I think it must have been 76, 78, maybe about the time that we're at Yale. And postmodernism was all the fashion in the architectural journals. And I haven't seen the exhibit yet, but I know this group. And I know there's very little that, the postmodernist decorative, decorated shed kind of thing.
I can discuss
There's
it.
very little of that in this
put that slide
vocabulary.
up?
I can discuss it in terms of the exhibition. Oh, do you want to get?
No, go ahead.
Just the first two diagrams there. Wait, hold on. The first two. So the first diagram is parallel projection or axonometric.
By the way, those are brilliant.
Thank you. I agree with whatever you were saying. The second diagram, historically that would be earlier, it's perspective, but that's considered in the show a retrogression back to postmodernism. And so the first diagram we call parallel projection and Pantone. The second one is Prismacolor, perspectives, and placemaking. And in fact, in the upper part of the show, we build a kind of chunk of perspective and put projects that I think fall more properly into a kind of postmodern idiom up there. And the main gallery here, I think, tries to say that that was a feature here, but isn't, my argument is that wasn't really the main one. You want me to put that one up? It's on here.
Yeah.
Oh. I'll let you talk about that one.
We found this a couple of days ago in the office. This is a montage we made roughly that time. It's interesting that what you mentioned. I think that that's a pinball house there, and for people who don't know, that's Robert Venturi. And I think, in my sense, was that the intellectual threat, let's say, wasn't from modern architecture, whoever Zimmerman was advocating, but Venturi, who was extremely articulate, extremely intelligent, whether you liked what he was building or not, and had a very different kind of argument from a very different background, which was also part of the discussion in Los Angeles, because Charlie Moore was hanging around in Berkeley before then he went to Yale, and he came back to UCLA, kind of Pied Piper, and dragging a whole group of characters with him. So I think the adversary is Graves, by the way, and I think none of this should be understood in an acrimonious or in a personal way. I mean, what was I think interesting about him is at a very early stage, when the work was very conceptual and very fragile, and it was very experimental. And then over a period of time, like a lot of work, it comes to be a method and a system and a kind of redundancy. But I think there was much less concern about modern architecture and much more concern with the Venturi Las Vegas argument. And I think with good reason, because he played a substantial role in changing the content of the discussion. And I think there are things that he said that we could support in terms of what his adversaries were or who they were, even if you didn't necessarily agree with what he thought the next move would be.
I should add that the catalog we didn't deal with this question at all in the exhibition explicitly, but the catalog has a lot of material on this question. How does this work? How is this work differentiated from East Coast postmodernism? What are its roots in modernism? And I think part of it, certainly something that came up a lot in the discussion, was the fact that late modern architecture in LA was substantially more exuberant than a lot of the stuff that Venturi had in mind when he was, doing his thing.
Eric, this is, I guess, what about that?
What about
Because, the other side, which I don't think we have a picture of, but the 5 condominiums in Pasadena, which seem...
It got built.
I know, but I look at this thing and I see Indian stepwells, I see the Easter Island heads, I see a lot of stuff, I see toilet paper rolls, I see a lot of associations which seem to be, I see the kind of cranked windows, but they seem to be making the kind of associative, linguistic kind of conversation that Venturi was making. And I wonder, to build on this question of the conversation at the time and Venturi's role in it, how would you position something like this against something that was happening in Philadelphia at the same time?
See, you can discuss that now, looking back, but I think you guys are incorrect in looking at this in terms of a response to a provocation from a different part of the country. That I think, looking at it later, even now, that the East Coast could never digest the West Coast. I don't think the West Coast had any interest in the East Coast. I think that
Well, you had a little.
yeah, this is a kind of jocular thing, though. And I think the point would be that the making of the pinball house belongs to a very different kind of criteria than learning from Showtime in Las Vegas. It represents something quite different, not something similar, except in a parallel discourse that what was, I mean, this is a longer, you know, Labitude, Charlie Moore, Princeton, Yale, which we know in retrospect. I don't think anybody was paying a hell of a lot of attention to that at the time it was going on. So they're very different pedigrees, intellectual pedigrees, that led to very different kinds of movements in architecture. And my sense is that, and it's still my sense in some ways, that Los Angeles was largely disinvolved and didn't care very much about who was white and silver. Nobody gave much of a damn about that. Venturi, I think, because of the publication of his work, and it's hard to miss that, but I think there was something about Los Angeles that had to do with more Los Angeles on its own, or architecture which intrinsically belonged to the architect, as opposed to something which was a response to what somebody else imagined. I don't think it worked that way. Anybody else? Hey.
You posed the question of whether or not we could learn something or tie it all together. My question is sort of the relevance of today. I mean, not whether it's successful, because obviously it was. You had a dialogue going for your words and the media and the drawings, but is today the drawing as artifact as important? Is there a dialogue going on between colleagues as you guys were all having, whatever it is you were intentionally saying? Or not?
That to me, Dana? Is that directed to me? Is there
I don't know. Whoever said that, I mean, if you're trying to tie it together, is it relevant today? I mean, what are the are you guys all talking to each other through your drawings? Are the drawings as artifacts as important as they
I'm
were?
honestly not sure that anybody was talking at the time that this was done, except very sporadically. I mean, we used to joke. I mean, I remember meeting Frank at some discussion at the AA and hadn't talked to him in 8 months. Tom just left the same. I mean, it used to be a joke. We never saw each other in LA, but would see each other in other places. So before, I mean, there may or may not be a discussion going on now. The form is different, the format is different, the people are different, the interests, I think, are different. I think the way this work spoke was by building it, and I think that's interesting, that a lot of that work, I mean, I was looking at this thing, and I don't remember how many, but of the models that they took out of my office, a pretty good percentage were actually built. And the need to do that, and the interest in doing that in a way, it's like the Isosaki argument that you're learning how to do it, and the way you learn how to do it is actually by doing it. And I think that's also, those conditions are a little bit different now for lots of reasons. So I probably didn't answer the question. Anybody else? Before we go, I do want to thank Andy and Todd and how do you pronounce your name? Ewan. I didn't want to mispronounce it. And for the work that they did and the time that they spent and producing the catalog and the exhibition, I think it's stimulating, and I think the topic is important. There are obviously a lot of other venues for this, and so there'll be other discussions, including a couple at SCI-Arc, which I think are coming up at some point or other. So thank you very much for attending and listening and supporting and all the things you're doing, and see you soon.
Thank you. I was going to just say to everybody, case there